For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ken Quattro. I'm the guy who currently owns these comics, and at some point I'm supposed somebody else will be owning these. But what I'm here tonight is I'm trying to walk you through the history of comic books, starting with the 1930s and on up. But before I do, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and my own involvement with comics. I've been collecting comics and reading comics for a long time, since 1961, which was a few months after JFK took office, and actually a few days before Alan Shepard was shot into space. I can remember it so well because I remember going to a pharmacy in Wayne, Michigan with my parents, and they were picking up a prescription for me. While they're paying for the prescription, I wandered over to the spinner rack, and this one comic caught my eye and said, "The Flash." Well, the reason why it stuck in my mind is because the night before I'd watched Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color, and there was a show called Flash the Teenage Otter, and it was one of those true life adventure shows that they used to have. Well, I thought this was about an otter. Okay, it wasn't. Okay, it was what was on this cover was a guy in a court jester outfit being chased on a telephone wire by a guy wearing a skin-tight red outfit with a lightning bolt on it. I go, this looks cool. You know, so I took it up my parents, and they humored me, and they bought it. Well, over the next couple weeks, I read that comic so many times the cover fell off. Okay, so they continued buying comics for me, which was a mistake on their part. Okay, because I haven't stopped since. That was, but what really, really got me was this comic right here. This comic I got on July 17th, 1961. Now, again, you're going to wonder how I know that so well. It's because that young fellow in the back there is my older brother. And he took me up to a drugstore. Again, you know, my parents were just trying to get me out of the house. And I bought this comic. And this here opened my eyes that there was actually a history to comic books. At the time, I thought they were just, you know, characters, you know, appearing on a page. But there was much more to it than that. These guys had a history. This is the origins of all these characters like, you know, John Jones, Wonder Woman, The Flash, you know, who was my guy at the time, you know. And when I read this, it just changed everything. And from that point on, I just continued buying comics like crazy. I got more and more involved with it. Well, eventually, I was luckily in the right area. I grew up in the Detroit area, and it was kind of a hotbed for comic fandom at the time. There was a guy in Detroit. He was a professor at Wayne State University. It was Dr. Jerry Bales, and he was a natural science professor. Well, Jerry Bales is called the father of comic fandom, and he published a magazine called Alter Ego. Him and another kid, a young kid named Roy Thomas. And Roy Thomas was from Missouri, but they published this magazine. It was like a mimeograph magazine on that. And they gradually started making connections with other collectors and that around the country. Well, this was in 1960. So by 61, 62, 63, everybody started getting a little bit connected. And they would talk about it in the comics, in the letter columns of the comics, that they were you know, trying to reach other collectors. Well, when I found out that there was somebody in Detroit who, you know, who also collected comics, and it was an adult. I was just a little kid. I was 8 years old. You know, I was thrilled that there's actually somebody else other than me who actually read comics. So anyway, long story short, Jerry Bales was fantastic as far as like organizing things. He put together what's considered by a lot of people the very first comic book convention. It was in March of '64 in Detroit. And they had this first convention. It was just very small. It was only about 100 people showed up for it. Over the next couple of years, it grew a little bit. And at the third convention, I went there. Okay? Again, I was just a kid. It was at the Pickford Shelby in Detroit, which I'm sure nobody here remembers except him. You know. And I went there, and at that show, there was 175 people over 2 days. So we were a small group of people, time. But things had started. Comic fandom had really started by this time. It was really picking up like in New York. This gentleman here is Professor Rich Rubenfeld. He grew up in New York at that time, and he had the benefit of being at the very first comic book convention in New York City. Second, excuse me, Rich. Okay. And it was just, like I said, all of us were growing up together. The very first person, as a matter of fact, to sign up for the very first convention in New York was a kid named George Martin. He's now called George R.R. Martin. But he was the very first one to sign up for the very first convention in New York City. There was also another kid in New York City called George Klein. George Klein later, he was publishing fanzines. George Klein changed his name to Gene Simmons, and he put together a band later on you might have heard of. Okay. So there was a lot of people getting involved in comics, and we're all kind of like, geeks together. A lot of times we were the kids who, nobody else hung around with. We were the quiet ones. We were the studious ones. We were the ones that were a little strange, read comic books and that. And anyway, long story short, I became more and more involved in these comics. Jerry Bales also put together, and this to me was the thing that really changed stuff for me. He put out this magazine called The Panelologist. Bales was the first one to really treat comic books as a serious subject. And I subscribed to this at the time. It was like in the late 60s. And it dawned on me that you could actually study comics as you could any other art form. There was more to it, what I'm trying to say, than just some cheap throwaway item that was printed on cheap paper for kids, which is the way comics had always been treated. Anyway, over the years, I started researching all this stuff. And the thing about comics is it's kind of unique. The people who wrote the history of comics, who have written it up to this point, are its fans. It's not professional historians most of the time. It was its fans who became the historians. And it was kind of neat because we identified so much with the people who were actually creating the comics, with the writers and the artists and stuff like that. And us early guys, we had a chance to talk to these guys. I've met Jack Kirby, I've met Will Eisner, I've met these different guys at different points in my life. I know Rich did, I know some of you others have. And it was a fantastic experience. It's something that I can't explain. In almost any other field, you never get to meet your heroes. I mean, if you're an athlete, what are your chances of meeting LeBron James? Or if you're an author, are you going to run into Stephen King on the street? Probably not. But I got to go and talk to Will Eisner for a half hour. Just sat down with him and just talked to him. And it was amazing, to do this stuff. And so that's where all, the history was first accumulated. But there's a flaw in that. And the flaw is that you identify so much, it's so personal to you, that your own biases and prejudices enter into the writing and the research. So over the years, I've taken a different tack. I sort of like erased as much of the prejudice in that as I could and started treating it all like I would a news story. I studied journalism at the University of Michigan many years ago. And, you learn a way of writing with journalism, at least we used to, where you set aside your biases and your prejudices. You try to look at things just from the facts you're presented with. And so the research I've done over the years is based upon primary sources as much as possible. I've read so many publications. What I do is I try to find the contemporaneous publications to do my research from. If I'm writing about somebody from 1920, I read newspapers and magazines from 1920. I don't base my thing upon what somebody else has written and then extrapolate from that. I've filed so many Freedom of Information Act things to get, like, for instance, there's a publisher named Lev Gleason who was a communist. I got his FBI file, and it was a huge file about this thick. Well, I've written a whole series of articles based upon his file. It was fascinating stuff. I've gotten trial transcripts. I've researched libraries. I've been in contact with people all over the world to get information. And that's my approach to comics research. And anyways, it's kind of different from a lot of people. And over the years, I've kind of developed my own little way. I call myself the comics detective because I'm not so much a historian, I believe, as a person who goes out and finds the facts and just presents them to people. Because I'd like you to make up your mind about about what I've found. I have a book coming out next year. I might as well, my publisher asked me to do this. It's called Invisible Men, okay? It's going to be published by a company called IDW, and it's going to be distributed by Random House. It's about the black comic artists who emerged during the Golden Age. There was really only a handful of them at the time, but what's intriguing about them is they're hardly ever mentioned, except for a few of them. There's one named Matt Baker and a couple others, but most of them were never even mentioned in most comic histories. And there's a specific reason why, and it's because they took over the jobs that a lot of white artists had when they went into service. Black artists were overlooked a lot of times by the draft. The first couple of years of the draft, they weren't drafting blacks. Even though they were available for the draft, the draft boards would pass them by. So they were available to take the jobs of the white artist, but they also weren't allowed into the offices of the publishers a lot of times. So they did a lot of their work either at home or working for what's called comic shops. They were studios which were set up almost like production lines. But they wouldn't physically be in the shop. They would still do their work outside the studio and bring it in to the comic shop. Anyway, that's what the book is about. I think it's good. It's exciting. There's some really interesting stories in there, and comes out next fall. Buy a lot of copies. Tell your friends to buy them, stuff like that. It'll make my publisher really happy. Anyways, this is some of the stuff I've written. Some of the books, things like that. Like I said, I've been around for a while. Okay. Anyway, to the history of comics. In some way or another, comics have been around, or graphic art and story have been around literally since people started communicating. I mean, if you want to go back to pictographs on cave walls or hieroglyphics, in some way or another, it was a form of communication to use pictures and words together. Obviously, they weren't comic books, but it's a long-standing fact. That's where it started. The real comic book started probably in the 1840s here, and there was a Swiss immigrant who started comics over here, and but it didn't really catch on as a real form of communication until much later on. In the beginning, comics were basically for advertising purposes and stuff like that. They would be put out in different sizes. There was no set format or anything like that. But this one here was for what became Coates and Clark thread. Okay, this here came out approximately in 1890. Okay, and what it is, again, it's just words and pictures, together and that. But it gives you an idea where it was just. They were developing the idea of communicating through these little tiny pamphlets. But the idea of the comic book as we know it today really didn't start to probably like 1929, 1930 and that, where they started getting the idea of putting together sequential artwork to tell a story. Obviously, comic strips had been around for a while. They started approximately around 1890. But the first comic books that developed here in the United States. And the United States is basically we're sort of like the breeding ground for comic books. Even though you can't really say we invented it, we popularized it. And in the beginning, the comic books that were, first took place here in the 1930s and that were promotional comics. And that is that they would be, there'd be a company or there'd be somebody who needed something that they wanted to promote, and they would, contract a publisher or a printer or an artist put together something to promote their product. Here's an early one right here. This is Gulf Week. This is from 1933. Okay, and it's one of those things you'd be giving away to Gulf gas station, one a week. You go in there, it's a 4-page format. Has thing here by, well, here's something about Will Rogers, okay, who's big at the time. And anyway, this is what comics were in the beginning. There's no established format. There's no real set idea. Many times they were just reprinted comic strips that they would put into, this form. So for the first couple years of the 30s, that's what was going on. Comics were just sort of like an amorphous kind of thing where it was just, basically whatever you wanted is what you would publish. And there was different formats that they tried. But finally, approximately, around 1935 or so, they came up with what's basically the comic book format that you know now. And the first comics that came up during that time, well, this one here is missing a cover, but this is from 1936, for instance. This is called Wow, What a Magazine, okay? Now, this is a comic, by the way. At my age, I don't get excited too much, okay? But last year, I found this on eBay, okay? And I got it, and I can't tell you how excited I was to find this thing on eBay. Nobody else bought it because it was missing a cover. But anyway, this magazine here was published by a guy named John Henley. John Henley was a woman's clothing manufacturer, and he wanted to become a publisher, which at that time, anybody who wanted to make money, this is the 1930s, in the midst of the Great Depression, okay, anybody who had a little bit of money was trying to find another way to make money. And Henley, who had some money, decided he wanted to be a publisher. So he set aside part of his woman's clothing factory and set up a publishing firm, okay? And he hired a guy named Jerry Iger to put together a comic staff. Jerry Iger was a cartoonist from the 1920s, been around, never made much money, never done much of anything. But to put together a staff to create this comic book. The staff he put together is incredible. It was a bunch of kids, a bunch of no-name artists and stuff like that, and they were getting paid almost nothing. But he hired a guy named Will Eisner. He hired a guy named Bob Kane. He hired another guy, Bernard Bailey, and there was a whole list of these guys who later became legends in the comic book industry. So it only lasted 4 issues until late in 1936, and it went under, which was very typical of the time. You publish a few issues of something, and then it dies. But that wasn't enough for Will Eisner, okay? Eisner is my hero. Will Eisner is my all-time hero. My wife could tell you that. She knows very well. I've met the man, and he had this Promethean genius. He could see things that nobody else could. He saw things about the comic industry that nobody else at the time even envisioned. The comic book industry was the lowest end of publishing that there was. It was, matter of fact, Eisner himself said it was just above pornography as far as like status. But Eisner saw something more. He saw it could be something more. So what he did is when they lost their job and all these artists were out on the street after WOW went out of business, he went up to Jerry Iger and said, hey, how about we put together a staff of these same guys and create comics on our own? So Iger went along with it. They had $15 to start with, to start their studio, okay? And they put together a studio called Eisner and Iger, okay? Very clever, okay? In a brief period of time, though, between the end of WOW and the beginning of their studio, about a 4-month period, Eisner freelanced on his own. And one of the comics he did was in here. It's called Western Picture Stories. This is one of the first Western comics. Okay, this is from 1937 here. And it was a very brief period where he did about a half a dozen stories on his own. When I met him and showed him these comics, he totally forgot he'd even done them. Yeah, and he autographed all these for me too, which is really cool at the time. Anyway, so they started Eisner and Iger. Well, Eisner and Iger, their first job was kind of unique. Excuse me for a second here. their first job was for a guy called Joshua B. Powers. Joshua B. Powers was a really interesting guy. He ran a thing called Editor's Press, which did all their publishing overseas. He was an American from New York City, but all their publications were overseas, particularly in South America and in Great Britain and Australia. Well, he hired Eisner and Iger to create new comics for him. And they were only sold overseas. And the thing they created was called Wags. Now this is the Australian version of it, okay? It is so incredibly rare in this country. This is another one. It took me about 40 years to find. This is from 1937, I believe. Yeah, 1937. And what it is, they created new comic stories, which was a totally unique idea. I'll give you an idea here. This here, what they do is they would reprint some existing strips like Tarzan, but at the same time, they also did their own. This is Peter Pup by Bob Kane. Bob Kane, later on, a few years later, was co-creator of Batman. Okay, but this is when they're kids. These guys were all about 18, 19 years old, to give you an idea, who were doing this stuff. Well, they were so far ahead of everybody else at the time. Hawks of the Seas. This is Will Eisner himself. And Eisner, to make it look like they had a bigger studio, he would use different drawing styles in different names. He would make up different names to make it look like their studio was bigger than it was. Well, this contract lasted till about 1938 or so with Joshua Powers. And at that time, they lost the contract. So Eisner and Iger took the artwork, and they went around and they tried to find American publishers to publish the same artwork that they'd already published overseas. So ironically, what they did was, it was Americans drawing artwork for overseas publication who turned around and then was basically reprinted here in the United States. And some of the characters they created for Wags was like Sheena, who was basically the prototypical jungle princess. There's been Sheena movies made. There was a Sheena television show back in the 50s and everything. But any version of a jungle princess you know was based upon Sheena. Well, that was one of the characters they created. But their comic staff that they'd hired also included guys like Jack Kirby. The very first artwork Jack Kirby ever did was for Eisner and Iger. Jack Cole, Louis Fine, and it goes on and on and on. And it's almost like they were the wellspring that almost everything else evolved from, was the Eisner and Iger shop. Anyway, what they did was they resold that same artwork to Fiction House. Fiction House was a publisher of pulps. And pulps, I know I'm kind of jumping around here, folks, but I'm trying to cover a lot of ground. Pulps were these things. Okay, pulps were these magazines that were published particularly in the 20s and 30s and into the 40s. And they were obviously printed on pulp paper, the cheapest paper you could possibly find. And they were geared more towards adults and older young men and stuff like that. It was like detective stories and stuff like that. Like this one here has a story about the shadow and things. To give you an idea, what it was. Well, a lot of these pulp publishers were looking a way to make money, and they went into comic book publishing, and one of them was Fiction House. Well, Fiction House hired Eisner and Iger to create Jumbo, and it's basically just the stuff that they had in Wags, and they put it into here, okay, and they redid it, for the American market, so they double dipped, is what they did. Oh, God. Anyway, where was I? Sorry, I'm just kind of jumping around here a little bit. That's pretty much where comics were for the first couple years of their existence in the 30s. But then in 1938, there was a couple kids in Cleveland, okay? And actually, it started in the early 30s. They created a character. They tried making a comic strip that they tried selling to everybody. They tried every single syndicate they could find. They contacted all these editors. They went everywhere, and they couldn't sell it. So at the time, they were just working for, they were working at comic books, But they were just doing stories on a piecemeal basis, on a freelance basis, getting paid per page for the work that they would do. But in 1938, they created this. There's a guy called Superman. Okay, this isn't Action Comics #1. If it was, I would have sold it a long time ago. I'd be living in Tuscany right now. But anyways, this is a reprint of it. And they sold the story to a guy named Sheldon Mayer. Sheldon Mayer was working for the McClure Syndicate, and he too was a kid. Again, you have to understand that these guys at this time, this is the 1930s, okay? And there weren't a whole lot of jobs out there for anybody. And so to make any money at all, these guys would work for almost nothing, okay? So anyways, they sold this character, Superman, finally to Sheldon Mayer. And this is after about 6 years of everybody else refusing to buy it, okay? Nobody wanted it. Well, they published this comic, and it went nuts. And the owners of DC, well, which was the company at the time, Detective Comics, who bought it, realized what they had. So they went to the two kids from Cleveland, who was Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and they offered them some money to buy the character from them. So they sold Superman to DC for $130, okay? Well, if you just think about how much money Superman's made over the years, it's disgusting. In recent years, Siegel's family has retrieved part of that money back, not anywhere near what it's worth in that, but it kind of establishes the whole, how can I say, relationship that artists had with publishers at the time. And it was like the publishers had these guys by the throat, and they pretty much could do anything they wanted. And it was a very contentious relationship, is a nice way of putting it, I guess, between the artists and the publishers. Anyway, I'll jump around again. After Superman, everybody wanted superheroes, okay? And DC, in particular, was cranking them out, one right after another. They came up with Batman. This is an early Batman here. This character here is called Our Man. He literally would take a pill, and for 1 hour, he had superpowers. It was kind of stupid. It's kind of weird. It was kind of like a Viagra tablet he would take. Yeah, I was waiting for you, John. I could tell by the look on your face. Anyway, he had superpowers for 1 hour. But anyways, it was making all kinds of money, and everybody wanted superheroes. And that carries over to today. And that's one of the misconceptions that people have about comic book history, is when they think about comic books, they think about superheroes and think that's all it is, or that's all it was, and it's not true. Even though superheroes were super popular back in the early 1940s, it was a short period of time, really, from about 1938, when Superman was created, to approximately the end of World War II. And at that time, people were getting tired of it. Just like any genre, just like any fad, people got tired of it. And so at that time, they started developing all different genres of comics. And by that, I mean, like, there was Western comics, there was science fiction comics, romance comics, anything you could think of. But in particular, there was crime comics. And the crime comics really started with a comic called Crime Does Not Pay. And it was published by a company called Lev Gleason. Lev Gleason is one of the most fascinating guys in comics. Like I mentioned earlier, he was a communist. And he was noted prior to that time for publishing communist material. That's what he published. And he decided to get into comic books. And he was a wealthy guy from Boston. And he had all kinds of money. A very established family going back hundreds of years in the Northeast there. But Lev Gleason published this comic called Crime Does Not Pay. Lev Gleason, in 1946, was indicted by Congress for lying to the, contempt of Congress for lying to the House Un-American Activities Committee. And him along with about 15 other guys, and these are all different guys throughout different parts of like the media and stuff like that, were all indicted at the same time. A bunch of them went to prison. He didn't. And from my research, I found that he basically flipped on a lot of these guys and that, even though they didn't know it at the time and that. My research through the FBI and that is that old Lev Gleason was playing both sides of the street later on. And there was a lot of things that came out that they didn't know about. He just got fined, but these other guys went to prison. But before this all happened, old Lev put out this comic. And it was about half a dozen issues of this comic came out. It's called Young Life, and it changed its name to Teen Life, and it came out in 1945. And it was published by New Age Publishing, which people didn't know was the publishing wing of the Communist Party. And it was a regular newsstand comic book aimed at children. And it's something nobody else has done a lot of research on, except me. And I'm going to write something about this later on. I'm not going to say too much about it right now, but it's really fascinating, to see the backstories of all these comics, because here's my thing: comic books are just, it's a form of popular media, but they were so integrated into everything else that was going on in the world. In a lot of ways, comic books were a snapshot of what was happening at the time throughout the country and actually throughout the world. And just to show you what I'm talking about, here's a French comic, okay, called Aventures, okay? The French were the first ones to republish superhero comics, American superhero comics. They were the first ones to do it. They started in 1939. And somewhere here I have the very first Superman story and that, that the French republished. Well, this is from 1941. And this was published in Lyon, France, which, if you know anything about 1941 in Lyon, France, that was the capital of Vichy, France. Well, what they did was, there's a Superman story in here. They took the Superman story, which was, had originally appeared here in the United States, and they changed it. In this story here, Superman beats up two guys who look like Mussolini and Hitler. Well, guess what? They don't look like Mussolini and Hitler in here, in this story here. And they totally changed the story. This is the story right here, okay? And it's fascinating to read this. Soon after, 2 issues after this, the Nazis prohibited this from being published, and Superman couldn't be published again until after war was over in France. But I have a bunch of, if you guys want to come and take a look at some of the stuff later, I have comics from all different countries from World War II and everything. It's really interesting to see. I have a Nazi comic here, actually. Let me put it this way. I'll show you. This charming little comic here about Easter, it's from 1940 Nazi Germany, okay? Now, you never think about normal people in Nazi Germany, but there were people living just normal lives in Nazi Germany, and this is, like I say, it's a kid's comic. It's very strange to see this stuff, to realize. It gives you a different perspective on things. When you step back and you get to see this stuff from, instead of being so myopic and right up on top of it all the time. If you can step back and you see people as people, instead of just as a stereotypical, visage of something, it's really interesting. Like I say, I'll let you flip through this stuff later if you guys want to take a look at it. Anyway, get back to American comics. After 1945 or so, when with the fall of the superhero and stuff like that, publishers were looking for all different ways to get into comics. One of the big things they got into was promotional comics again. Promotional comics are very lucrative because a publisher would get paid up front by a company to put out a comic. they would go to, a company would go to a publisher and say like, I need 100,000 copies, to push my product, whatever it might be. And they'd pay for it up front, which was great because most comic books at that time, a publisher would just take a chance. You'd print 100,000 copies, you might only sell 50,000. You're stuck with 50,000 pieces of paper then afterwards. And what they did a lot of times is they would repurpose those comics, they call them remainders. And they would put them into a different format. They would stick them all together and try to sell them again, basically. This here is the thickest comic book ever published. It is. It's over 500 pages. And I haven't counted them, but I'm pretty sure it's over 500 pages. Published by Archer St. John, who was brilliant. He was another guy. He's one of my heroes. And this guy was brilliant when it came to different things in comic publishing. He was from Archer St. John. I'll just give you a quick idea, which George over there well knows because he helped me with the research, was from Chicago. And back in the 1920s, Archer St. John was a crusading reporter, and him and his brother Robert had gone after Al Capone. They lived in Cicero, Illinois, and they published a thing called the Cicero Tribune, and they went after Al Capone. Right, George? Yeah. Yep. This man's an expert here. By the way, if you ever saw the movie Road for Perdition, this is the man who supplied all the information for it and everything. Right there. He's a genius. Anyways, so Archer St. John, his brother, didn't make Al Capone very happy. So one day, him and his boys picked up Archer, took him out, and they beat the heck out of him. And they dumped him out in the woods. They also took Robert, and they beat him up too. And they threatened both these guys that they were going to kill him and everything, but they kept publishing. Okay. Eventually, to get him out of business, Al Capone bought the paper. He bought the Cicero Tribune. He figured if you can't beat him to death, I'll just buy the company. So they left Chicago and they went their opposite ways. Robert St. John became a big-time reporter with NBC. Matter of fact, he was a guy who was the first man to broadcast the end of World War II. He was the first person to broadcast the news on NBC. And became a very famous reporter later on. Archer, though, went into comic book publishing. And like I said, he was one of those guys who was very far-sighted, and he was trying everything, to sell comics. The problem was he was a genius when it came to different, trying different things, but he was too far ahead of the time. He was a lousy businessman, which happens with a lot of times with guys. But anyway, Archer, one of the things that he tried was publishing comic books in this format here, like paperback size. He published two of them. One was called It Rhymes with Lust, which sounds really sexy and everything like that, but it's not as sexy as it sounds. It was basically a pot boiler about a woman who was a widow who kills off her husband, and then she took over his company and she uses all these different men to further her ambitions. And the second one they published was called The Case of the Winking Buddha. These were a huge failure, but it was a brilliant try. And these are considered prototypical prototypes of what later became the graphic novel. Because up to that point, there had been a few other attempts by guys like Lynn Ward and stuff like that to have these called wordless novels, where it'd be pictures telling a story in that. But the first real attempt by writers and artists together to publish a comic book was these two books here, and this is one of them here. Anyway, where was I? Okay. That was the promotional comics. That's what I was getting back to. There was all different styles of promotional comics and everything you could conceive of. This is one that Disney put out in 1942. It was for the movie Dumbo. And it would be given away at theaters, one a week for, I think it was 16 weeks they did it. And kids would come in, you go see a movie, and they'd give you one of these. And there was a binder you could buy. You literally can still have, find the binders in that. That's why there's the punch holes in it. And you would put them all together, and you would have a whole collection of comics in that. It was a brilliant idea, but Disney's always making money. Then there's, this continued on right up through the 1950s, and that was probably the prime thing of comics. I'm sure at one time or another, all of us had this, big boy comics. This is an early big boy comic from about 1958. And at the time, these were published by what was called Timely or Atlas Comics. This company later became Marvel. Okay, so a lot of the artists who created the Marvel comic books worked on Big Boy in the beginning, which is kind of neat. This is by Dan DeCarlo, by the way. If you ever read an Archie comic in the 1960s, that's Dan DeCarlo, okay? Great artist. I met him too. Anyways, this comic here, Adventures in Disneyland, this was given out the day Disneyland opened. If you walked in the door of Disneyland the day it opened, they gave you this, okay? Very cool. What else? Oops. This was from NBC Studios, 1948. If you took a tour of NBC Studios, and there's still, somebody wrote the date on here that they went and visited the studio, 1948, they would give you this comic. And again, there's a lot here. There's literally thousands upon thousands of promotional comics which haven't been fully researched to this point. I have a couple hundred of my own, which neither here nor there. What else? Oh, this one here. This is given out at Ford Rotunda. Now, if you're of a certain age, when you grew up in the Detroit area, at Christmas time, you went to the Ford Rotunda. And literally, it was a big round building. It was built for the 1940 World's Fair. And it was the Ford building. After that fair ended, Ford disassembled this building in New York and reassembled it in Dearborn. And it was just a huge round building, and they would have different trade shows there and auto shows and things like that. Well, Christmas time, they had this fantastic Christmas display. And like I said, the ones who grew up in the Detroit area at that time would know what I'm talking about. But for the 8 years that they did it, they would give away this comic when you go in there. And if any of you know who Richard Scarry is, if you ever read children's books, he was the illustrator of these comics from 1954, I believe it was, up to 62 when the Rotunda burned down. Okay, whoops. Anyways, that's what this is here, but it was drawn by Richard Scarry. Again, there's so many people who worked in comics at various times that would stun you. There's a lot of famous writers who worked in comics. Trying to think of one. Oh, Patricia Highsmith. If you ever saw the movie Carol, or Strangers on a Train, or was it Mr. Ripley? They were all written by Patricia Highsmith. Well, she wrote comic books for 8 years. Mickey Spillane, the Mike Hammer comics and stuff like that. Mickey Spillane, let me find it here. Sorry, folks. I just got to show you this one comic. This one cracks me up. To me, this is the greatest cover ever on a comic book. Isn't that great? Look at that. I mean, you talk about put absolutely no effort into creating a cover. Look at this. And you can't lie. It's 256 pages. That's it. Anyways, I love it. They made it red, white, and blue, too. I mean, that was great. Anyway, hang on a second here. I know you guys read these, right? Classic comics and that. You're growing up in that. That's the only comic books my brother kept from the 50s. He couldn't have kept, he grew up in the 1940s and 50s, and you'd think he would have kept everything. He kept the classic comics. Thanks, Bob. Where is that comic at? Who cares? Let me show you another comic. This comic here is another interesting one. I got to tell you about this. This was published by Bernard Bailey. Bernard Bailey was kind of like a working man's genius. This guy, Bernard Bailey, matter of fact, he's the guy who drew this. He created superheroes net for DC, and he was actually one of DC's biggest artists. But he decided he wanted to make money on his own, so he started his own comic shop, his own studio. And the very first thing they published was this. He came up based upon classic comics, which had just started. He thought it'd be a great idea to publish a series of comics based on the opera. And everybody knows how much kids love opera. Okay. Well, I interviewed his kids and everything. I've written several articles about Bernard Bailey, and I interviewed his children. And they said for years they had piles of these comics around their house because he couldn't sell them. What he tried doing was distributing these comics through subscription and through music stores, okay, which a very limited audience, you know. He wanted 50 cents for this comic when everybody else was publishing 10 cents, and it's 16 pages long. You know, it wasn't a very good deal, and it was a huge failure. But he never gave up, and he kept trying all these different things. Later in the 50s, he published these 2 digest-sized comics, okay, for boys only, and then, of course, for girls only. Well, again, this was a huge failure, you know. But he was always trying different things, and he used to call himself the almost man. I love that, because he said he almost made it. His thing was this, he almost made it all the time. I can identify with that. Eek. Okay. I'll come back to that. What else can I show you? Oh, one thing that's overlooked a lot were religious comics. This particular one was published by M.C. Gaines, Max Gaines. Max Gaines takes credit for discovering Superman. He was the boss of Sheldon Mayer in McClure. And anyways, he used to claim that he was the one who created comic books. And he was there at the beginning, but he really didn't create comic books. Anyways, he became a partner with Harry Donenfeld, the guy who owned DC, Detective Comics. And he had his own division called All American Comics. They had a falling out, and he left. And he started his own company called Educational Comics, or EC. He was a former teacher, and he wanted to basically publish educational type comics. And he also had a guilt complex because he made a lot of money on a character called Wonder Woman. He had Wonder Woman created for him by a guy named William Marston. Okay, and William Marston is a whole story unto himself. He was a very strange guy. He was a psychologist. He was one of the creators of the lie detector, and he was a fraud in a lot of ways. And he also had a very strange living arrangement where it was him, his wife, and his girlfriend all lived together. They made movies about him. There's a movie that came out a couple of years ago called Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman. And I just happened to be the historical consultant on the movie. And I ended up having a falling out with the director about the direction she took the movie. That's something else. But anyways, it was a very interesting character. But anyways, he felt kind of guilty about it. So his whole thing was to publish educational type comics. And that's what EC started out doing. Well, he died in a boating accident on Lake Placid in 1947. And his son took over. And his son's name was Bill Gaines. Bill Gaines had no interest in comics. He didn't want anything to do with it. He was just stuck because his dad died and his mom made him take the company over. So what he did was he hired a guy named Al Feldstein. Al Feldstein was an artist who'd worked on a number of comics in the 40s. And Gaines hired him as his main editor. Well, they came up with what they called it was the new trend comics. And what it was is they decided to totally change the way comics were done. They created science fiction comics, and crime comics, and horror comics. But to do so, they hired the best artists and illustrators available. And they paid them more than anybody else. And EC changed from educational comics to entertaining comics. And it just totally changed everything because they were no longer being published for kids. These comics were aimed more at like almost like college-age kids, and they're brilliant. I mean, the artists who work for them are guys like Wally Wood, Frank Frazetta, Al Williamson, which, if you don't know comics, doesn't mean anything to you, but if you do, you recognize all those names. And these guys were brilliant artists. And almost every single one of these EC comics was a classic unto itself. But the problem was they took it too far. But they weren't the only ones. What had happened with comic books, I have to back up here a little bit. Almost from the get-go, comic books were under criticism by a lot of different people. In the beginning, it was basically educators, librarians, stuff like that, who criticized comics for, because they said they were written for illiterates. They didn't like the way the artwork was, they didn't like the lettering, they didn't like the language that was used in comics, and they criticized them for that. But as time went on, especially after Wonder Woman was created and crime comics started, people started worrying about the violence and the sex that was being depicted in comics. Now, from our point of view, you think about, oh, it must really have been bad stuff. But a lot of it was very mild in comparison to stuff you see nowadays anywhere, like on television, stuff like that. But in the 1940s, it was very worrisome to a lot of parents. And what really set things off was in early 1948. There was a guy named Dr. Frederick Werdum, okay? And he was a psychiatrist from New York. And he's literally an Austrian psychiatrist with a thick Austrian accent, just like you'd picture in an old movie, okay? Well, he made a reputation for blaming comics for everything, for every bit of violence, for every bit of juvenile delinquency, which was the big concern. He blamed upon comics. And he said it was comics reading that caused kids to do this stuff. Well, a lot of people listened to him. And he was all over the media. And he'd be on every radio show he could get on. He wrote books and everything. And it became a really, really big deal in the late 40s. Well, what happened was, even though comics were selling tremendous numbers, and it's hard to understand how big comics were at the time. Not most comics, but there were a lot of comics at the time that were selling over 1 million copies per month. Now, this is when the United States had less than 150 million people. And yet comic books were selling over, each individual comic, like say Walt Disney's Comics and Stories, was selling over 1 million copies a month. In the early 50s, in 1952, they estimated something like 200 million copies of comics per month were being sold, which is astronomical when you consider there weren't that many people in the country. And most times, a comic would be read by more than one person. So literally, it was a huge, huge part of the media. So when this guy was blaming comics for all the ills that were happening amongst children, people took it seriously. And a lot of weird things happened. I mean, a lot of religious groups, social organizations, the parent-teacher associations and stuff like that went around collecting comic books and having bonfires. And there's many pictures of these bonfires where you see people throwing comic books in and burning them. And it's almost like, Fahrenheit, where, people were taking these books and just burning them, because they were so afraid of what was being published. Now, on one hand, you say that's totally ridiculous. How could they possibly do stuff like that? But on the other hand, some of the stuff that was being published was out of hand. And there were some really schlocky publishers out there. There's one guy called Stanley Morris, okay? Stanley Morris published comics here. This is one of the milder covers. That's one reason why I brought this one here. Because there were some covers in that you wouldn't believe that he published, okay? You look at them today and you say, like, you gotta be kidding. They would sell these to kids because there was no restrictions. Any kid could go in and buy this comic. This particular issue here has a story in it called I Killed Mary, okay? The story is about a kid who grows up being bullied and everything by everybody around him, by his schoolmates, his family makes fun of him and stuff like that. So he is lusting after this girl named Mary while he's in high school. Well, he gets her alone in a barn, and he attacks her, and she resists him, okay? So he's mad, he grabs an axe, and he kills her. Now, this is a kid's comic, okay? He grabs an axe, and he kills her. Then he goes home, and he tells his parents about it, and they don't believe him. So he starts telling his friends, or the kids at school about it. They don't believe him, because he's such a wuss. Nobody can believe that he did this. So he goes, and there's a piano in here, he hangs himself right next to the girl's body. And then they find both their bodies later on, and they think somebody else did it. So he never even got credit for killing the girl. You know, well, this was brought up during the 1954 Senate hearings. There was a Senate subcommittee. Things had gotten so bad with comics that Congress had convened a subcommittee to look into juvenile delinquency. And one of the comics that they specifically talked about was this story right here, okay? And they had Stanley Morris on the stand, and they asked him, they say, how could you publish something like this, you know, for kids? And he said, I don't think there's anything wrong. He says, I think there was a moral to the story. And they said, well, what was the moral? He says that you shouldn't commit a crime. You know, but Stanley Morris is also the same guy who said later on, to be honest, I never even read my comics. So, you know, it was things like this that really put comics in a bad way. And so what happened was in 1954, to head off any government intervention, the comic publishers got together and they formed a thing called the Comics Code Authority. And what it was like a self-censoring group. And what they would do is they would take the comic book artwork before it was published, and they would send it to this group. It was this guy headed by Charles Murphy, who was a judge from New York, and he had like 2 or 3 women working there. And they would go through the comic pages, the artwork, and they would say, no, you can't show this, you can't show that. So they basically censored, you know, the comics. So after 1955, what came out, every comic that came out had one of these on it, this little stamp, okay? It was approved by the Comics Code Authority. Now, comic fans of, you know, they look upon this era as a horrible thing that happened in comics. In a way it was, because it truly wasn't fair. It drove a lot of publishers out of business. You know, a lot of marginal publishers, but a few hung on. DC hung on, which is the biggest at the time. Dell hung on. They're the ones who published all the Disney comics and things like that. Matter of fact, they refused to submit their artwork in that because they said there's nothing wrong with their comics. Matter of fact, their motto was, Dell comics are good comics. But a few comic companies hung on. And they had to find different ways to tell stories after 1955. There's no longer any horror comics. There's no longer any crime comics. So they started looking for different genres. So there was a lot of humor comics at the time. There was Western comics. When I was a kid, you know, cowboys were big when we were growing up, you know. Then around 1960, actually in 1956, DC started trying out different superheroes. The first one they tried out was The Flash. It was basically a revival of a character they'd had in the 1940s. They brought him back and they had a little bit of success with him. But it really wasn't until about 1960 when they put out a comic called Justice League of America, which grouped together all these comics, all these characters, into one group. And it started selling. Well, that caught the attention of a guy named Martin Goodman. Martin Goodman also had a comic book company. He had a company called Timely Comics, and they're the ones who, back in the 40s, had created Captain America and the Submariner and the Human Torch. But those characters had all, you know, faded away years and years before, back in the 40s. By 1949, basically, it stopped publishing superhero comics. And throughout the 1950s, they were publishing, it was like fantasy stories. And they published a lot of comics, but nothing really of note. I mean, they're very collectible nowadays, but there's nothing that you would know. But when Martin Goodman saw how popular the Justice League of America was, he asked his editor, a guy named Stan Lee, to come up with something to compete with DC's Justice League of America. So at the time, there was a guy working for Marvel named Jack Kirby. And Jack Kirby was a creation machine. I mean, this probably the most creative mind ever to work in comic books. And he would pump out comic book characters, you know, like nobody else, and nobody else ever has. And they came up with, and primarily Jack Kirby came up with this thing here called Fantastic Four. And this changed everything. This is in late 1961. It just happened to be the year that I started collecting comics. And that, as I said, I came along right at the right time. This here wasn't an immediate success, but not long after. And soon after, they created Spider-Man. You know, and then after that, they created Daredevil and the Hulk and all these other guys. And they're all creations of Jack Kirby. Rich here used to go to Jack Kirby's house, and that when he was a kid, you know, when he knew him. But I met Jack Kirby many years later, and I was fortunate enough to have him and Stan Lee both autograph this for me. And I don't know how many people have a copy of Fantastic Four #1 autographed by both of them, but it's pretty cool. You know, anyways, this is one of those comics I'll never sell. But Marvel Comics changed everything. And that's what started the whole revival of comic books. That's what really got comic fandom going in the 1960s. That's what really drove it, was Marvel Comics. Even though they weren't the best-selling comics of the 60s, that was still DC and Dell to a certain extent. They drove everything else. And that's what led to, you know, the Marvel universe that you see today. Trying to think what else. Jumping way ahead. In the 60s, like for instance, this is the second appearance of Black Panther here, okay? This was created, now you might think that Marvel stole the name Black Panther from the Black Panther group that was, you know, existed. Well, it turns out the Black Panther comic character existed more than a year before the Black Panthers did. So there's a very good chance they took their name from the comic book character. Like I say, comic books are a huge influence on a lot of different things. If you guys have read Ken Kesey, you guys know One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and stuff like that, he was a huge comic book fan. And his favorite character was Dr. Strange, which was done by Steve Ditko. Steve Ditko just died a couple months ago. He was 90 years old, very strange guy, but brilliant when it came to comics. He had it was a very unique style and very idiosyncratic style of drawing and a way of thinking. He was an Ayn Rand follower, an objectivist, if you guys know anything about that. And that's what his comics were basically, it was sort of like an underlying theme throughout all of his characters. And as time went on, he became more and more extreme in his views, and his comics became more and more out there, is the way I would put it. I'll be nice. Say. A very interesting character. Anyway, by the time of the 1970s, so comic books were pretty much dying out again. And it's just like everything's cyclical and stuff. And so a lot of new characters, or not a lot of new creators, were coming into comics at the time. One of them was a guy named Frank Miller. Frank Miller, sorry. Okay. Frank Miller basically deconstructed superheroes. And he just like reimagined what the superhero is. And his first real attempt at it was this, The Dark Knight. What it was is the violent version of Batman that you have now is not the version of Batman I grew up with, okay? The Batman I grew up with was sort of like an easygoing, jovial, him and Robin were, you know, going out solving crimes, and it wasn't as bad as the TV show, but almost as far as like, the silliness behind it. Well, Frank Miller said, that's not Batman. He said, Batman's nuts, okay? He said, there's something wrong with this guy. And so the vigilante Batman that we have now basically started with this. And this comic here basically created what's the grim and gritty type of superhero characters that we all have now. And personally, I don't like it. I mean, that's not what I like, but they're not aimed at me anyway. This is also autographed by Frank Miller. I had him autograph it for him when I was down in Dallas back in 1985 when it came out. And after he autographed it, he threw it at me. So he did. He said, this is the last one I'm autographing, and he threw it at me like this and walked away. He's not a very nice guy, but he's very talented. What did I do, Anyways, the other guy who came along during that time period was a writer named Alan Moore. Alan Moore is brilliant as far as like writing. He's also working for DC at the same time period, 1985, 1986. And what he did first, he did it with a character called Swamp Thing. He sort of like deconstructed Swamp Thing and came up with a different version of him. And then he did a thing called The Watchmen, which totally changed the way people looked at superheroes. They made a movie about it a few years back, which I don't think was very good, but it was a movie. And as a matter of fact, we're going to do a TV show right now. Then he also did this, The Killing Joke, which was then made to like a cartoon series and everything. Alan Moore's done so many things over the years, the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, right? Stuff like that, and V for Vendetta, if you guys ever saw that, the movie. It's just brilliant, writer. But that's what happened to comics eventually is no longer would you get just kids off the street who wanted to be artists. You were getting these guys who were established writers, guys like Neil Gaiman and different people like that, established writers and artists and that who were coming into the field, and it became something bigger. It's now, it's such a part of the national zeitgeist that it's permeated everything. Comic books, to me, are as legitimate an art form as anything out there. Whether you're talking about popular music, you talk about film or television, comic books are at least as popular as all that. And yet nobody knows anything about them. And that's why I take it upon myself as almost like a mission, in a way, to capture as much of this history as I can, while I can. Because too much of it's going to go away. And people, it's so hard to find this information anywhere. I mean, you talk about the three most popular characters come out of the 20th century. It's probably Tarzan, Mickey Mouse, and Superman. Now, Tarzan, most people know Edgar Rice Burroughs did it. Everybody knows Walt Disney did Mickey Mouse. How many people know Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster? Not that many, right? How many people, a lot of people know Jack Kirby now in a way, but do they know he created Captain America, the Hulk, Spider-Man, all this stuff? I mean, these things are worth billions and billions of dollars. This stuff is, it's part of our language. Somebody's a superhero. It's almost like a mythology that we have now. 1,000 years from now, if there's people still around, and they look back on the 20th century, and they find all these characters, they'll probably look at them as our gods. Because in a way, this is our mythology. And it's, like I say, I take it almost as a personal mission to record as much of this stuff as I can. And that's what all this is about, okay? I'm going to drop it right there because I know I'm getting boring. But anyways, this is some original artwork from some comics and that. I just want to show you real quick. If you guys know Pogo, okay, by Walt Kelly, Pogo started in comic books, okay? It was a comic book character for about 8 years before it ever became a comic strip. Brilliant. It was probably the greatest comic strip ever done, in my personal opinion. In that, this is Walt Kelly original here. let's see. I keep talking about Will Eisner and that. Well, Will Eisner, he had a contract. He was drafted in 1942, even though he tried getting out of it. That's something else. But he's drafted in 1942, and he was, his job when he was in the military, he went to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and his job there was to create posters and training material for the Army. Well, he came up with a character called Joe Dope, okay? And there's a whole series of posters and everything that he came up with. And, oh, heck, I can't find it. Oh, here it is. Joe Dope first appeared in a thing called Army Motors. And it was a preventative maintenance thing for fixing Jeeps and stuff like that. What was so clever about it, though, was Eisner took this opportunity to work on his cartooning. Because not only is Joe Dope a training thing, he came up with comic stories based on Joe Dope. And Will Eisner is best known for a character called The Spirit, which is, in my mind, the greatest comic book of all time. Okay, not this particular issue, but it ran in newspapers from 1940 to 1952. And what it was about a guy named Denny Colt. And he was just a detective. And what Eisner did is he said, that's not just good enough. I'm not just going to do it. I'm going to try pushing the boundaries on everything. And he totally changed the format of what people thought about comics. No longer was it just a grid pattern of 9 panels per page or 12 panels per page. He totally exploded all that. He, like you see here, like the title here, was always integrated into the splash page, which is the first page of the story. He would take all these cinematic angles in that. A lot of people figured that he stole stuff from Orson Welles, when it turns out that Orson Welles was reading The Spirit before he did Citizen Kane. So this guy was a genius, a true genius, and he lived up until about 10 years ago. And he came up with so many different innovations in comics. He basically established the entire visual language of comic books. And it was one man who did this. Like I say, he's a Promethean genius. It was just unbelievable. And another person who everybody should know, and they don't. He's probably one of the great American artists of all time. And your art history professor, Rich, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but they're just amazing. Yeah. But anyway, The Spirit would appear in newspapers. It was a comic book, but it would appear in newspapers. And it only appeared really in a handful of newspapers throughout the country. Okay, what else was I going to say about that? Oh, anyways, when he was in the Army from 1942 to 1945, he was hired, to do Joe Dope. And so he created I must have taken him out. Never mind. Anyways, he created this Joe Dope character in that, and it became very popular. Well, he left the Army, and they stopped using Joe Dope. But 6 years later, there was another war. It was the Korean War. Well, by that time, Eisner had a company doing promotional comics called American Visuals. And all they did was promotional comics. Well, he was hired by the Army to bring back Joe Dope in any kind of format he wanted. So he created this thing called PS Monthly. And this was a preventative maintenance magazine that was sent out throughout the maintenance corps in the Army and everything. This particular copy was Eisner's copy, and I bought from him, and he autographed it for me, which is pretty cool. Anyways, and again, he brought back Joe Dope, and it's brilliant comics that appear in these things. And I try to buy as many of these as I can. And it also appeared in Camp Newspapers Net, which I also have his copies of those too. A tremendous, tremendous character. What else here? You guys know BB gun? It was, BB gun used to be made in Plymouth, Michigan, okay? And this was a Daisy Handbook, which is published by him, which I'll be giving to my brother there who works at the Plymouth Museum, and they have to put on display there one of these days. This here was a comic. There was a kid's store called Superman Tim's, actually the Tim stores. And they went into business with DC. Actually, was Superman Incorporated, which was a separate division of DC, which just licensed everything for DC. And they published these giveaway comics called Superman Tim, which just, it was just a tie-in promotional thing in that they had. Again, nothing super special, but it's kind of neat. What else can I show you? Might be interesting. Let me show you some of the artwork. If you've never seen original comic artwork, I know a lot of people here have. It used to be done what they called twice up size, meaning it was twice the published size here. This is when the artist would draw it. They would draw it in pencil first, and then they would ink it, or someone else would ink it for them. And then it would be photographed and shrunk down to published size, okay? Well, one time they used to throw this stuff away. I actually bought these 2 pages here from you, George, back in the early 90s. Yeah. But these are Marvel Comics pages. This here is a Submariner page drawn by Bill Everett. Bill Everett created the Submariner in 1939. Well, he later worked on them briefly back in the late 60s and early 70s, and that before he died. It was inked by Vince Coletta, who was not a very good inker. But anyways, that's another matter. That's a personal opinion. That's editorial there. Anyways, he drew this page here and that. Ohio State University wants this from me. I've already talked to, what's her name, Jenny? Yeah. Anyways, Ohio State University, just so you know, he has the biggest collection of comic artwork probably in the world. And they also have this huge collection of comic material. And I've been in talks with them, Michigan State University, who also has a huge comic book collection. And also the Library of Congress has talked to me about buying the stuff of that once I'm done with it, which is fine with me. I'd like to keep this all together if possible, because I want it so people can research it. Okay, that means a lot to me. Because too much of the stuff has disappeared in the collections and nobody's ever going to see it. One of the big problems I have when I'm doing my research is they call it slabbing. And what it is a lot of expensive comics nowadays are put in these plastic cases, okay, and they're sealed. And people do it for all kinds of comics, but particularly old, expensive comics, okay? And they never take them out. To me, you might as well just take a photograph of it at that point. It's nothing. To me, it's worthless. Everything I have is researchable is the way I look at it. I want people to be able to open this up and read it. That's the whole point. That's what they were meant for. And that's, my intent is to try to keep this all together so at some point somebody will have access to it, later on, 100 years from now or 200 years from now. Anyway, that's what's going to happen with all this stuff. This page here is even cooler. This is from Strange Tales number 115, okay? And it was drawn by Dick Ayers. I had him autographed for me too. This is one of the earliest appearances, the second appearance of Spider-Man outside of his own comic book. And it's right here. It's the Human Torch and Sandman, the second appearance ever of Sandman. And this is a very cool thing here. This issue also, not this story, but this issue also contained the origin of Doctor Strange, which is neither here nor there, but it's kind of cool. Let's see what else. Oh, there was a guy named Doug Wildey, okay, who was, again, a personal favorite of mine. Did you guys ever watch Johnny Quest? You guys remember Johnny Quest, the cartoon? Okay? I love Johnny Quest cartoon. Well, Doug Wildey created Johnny Quest. He was an animator later on. but he began as a comic book artist. And he was always trying to break into comic strips, to sell his own comic strip. Well, in 1959, he came up with a comic strip he called Stretch Bannon. It was about a race car driver, okay? He couldn't sell it, okay? This is the very first Stretch Bannon strip. He kept two of the characters, though. Johnny Quest and Race Bannon, okay? These are the very first drawing of Johnny Quest ever, is right here, in Race Bannon. You know, it's just very cool. I love stuff like that. He was I get all excited looking at that. This is also drawn by Doug Wildey. Later on, he was also a great, great Western artist. And in the 1980s, he did a comic book called Rio, okay, which was, in my opinion, the greatest Western comic ever done. This is one page. It was a huge single panel page. And I just wanted to take a look at that. Look at the detail in the artwork that went into that comic there. Look at that. You know? I just love it. You know, to me, I just admire that so much because that was what I wanted to be more than anything else, was a comic book artist. I mean, I studied art for most of my life. And I briefly considered doing it back in the 1970s before I decided I would rather eat than become an artist. You know, that was the choice I had to make. Anyways, that's that. Let's see. This here was by an artist named George Carlson. George Carlson was an old-time artist. He's best known for, he did Peter Rabbit. He did a Peter Rabbit comic strip, and he did illustrate the books back in the 30s, stuff like that.
No, that's Harrison Cady.
Harrison Cady, no, what did he do? Not Peter.
Actually, it's really weird because I had almost all his files 4 years ago.
I love this.
A bunch of unpublished stuff.
Yeah.
That the family at some point wants to republish. He's got started with this quirky publisher called John Martin, who did a high-end kids book, kids magazine, starting in the 1920s that are just incredibly beautifully graphic books. They also did a series of books like that that were Christmas supplements
Right.
for a major.
You know, what did he do? He did one, not Peter Rabbit, then what am I thinking of?
Let's see, the Jingle Jangle.
Right, well, this is Jingle Jangle, by the way.
He goes to regular for like 4 or 5 years. It's a really popular kids comic strip.
Right.
In fact, I have one inscribed to George Carlson from George Burns, who technically signed it, and he flipped it over. It was one of Carlson's strips.
Right.
But he mainly worked, he did punch-out books, he did illustrated children's books. The guy was amazing.
Oh, amazing artist. I mean, I've seen a lot of his stuff.
He was also like Vernon Grant, who created Snap, Crackle.
Yeah, I was thrilled to get this then. It was me and, matter of fact, it was two of them. I got one and Rob Stolzer got the other. And that, and we split them up. Anyways, I digress. This is Felix the cat, okay? This is my wife's. I bought this for her back in 1990. She loves Felix the cat, okay? This is Otto Mesmer and Joe Oriolo was the inker on this. Later on, Otto Mesmer basically created Felix the cat, even though a guy named Pat Sullivan got credit for it. It was Otto Mesmer who created Felix the cat. This is from 1946. Joe Oriolo, who was the inker on this, later did the cartoons that you guys might remember from the early 60s and that. And his family still owns the rights to it. And matter of fact, my publisher was just working with him last week with Oriolo's son. And they're trying to republish some of these Felix comics. This here is a British comic strip. And try to guess why I picked this one. My wife's name is Patty. Okay. This is done by a female comic artist named Parita Campos, which means nothing to anybody in this room, except that Parita Campos is probably one of the best-selling cartoonist in the world. She's known all over South America, all over Europe, and was huge in Britain. This is a British comic, but she's a Spanish artist. And it was just great, artwork, just wonderful artwork in that. And this is just one of the pages there. I bought this from a British art dealer a couple of years back. Really nice artwork, though. I thought so. Okay. This here is it getting late? Am I boring everybody? Okay, this is from an EC comic. It's by a guy named Jack Davis. Okay, Jack Davis, everybody has seen Jack Davis's artwork, okay? I can guarantee it. Even if you've never read a comic book in your entire life, you've seen Jack Davis artwork. Well, he worked for EC. He did a number of things. He did a number of horror comics. He did humor comics, everything else. Well, this is a war comic that he did. And it's beautiful. Again, it's the wonderful thing about looking at the original artwork is you get to see the actual work that these guys put into this. And if you ever tried drawing yourself, which I know you have, you really appreciate, the skill that these men have. And Jack Davis just died, was about a year or so back, something like that?
A little beyond that, but yeah,
yeah.
pretty close.
Yeah, he lived up into his 90s and that. He was still very talented, still doing high quality work at the time, but just beautiful, beautiful artwork,
You probably saw it because he was often asked to illustrate pictures on cartoons on Time magazine.
Right, he did a lot of Time magazine covers and everything else and that. Yeah. What's that? Oh yeah, he did Mad magazine. Like I say, everybody's seen Jack Davis artwork. I can guarantee it. It's probably one of the best known cartoonists in the world. Getting back to Will Eisner again, he still had this contract with the military doing PS Magazine for many years, actually up until about 1980. Well, in the 1960s, they did a number of different, his studio was American Visuals, did a number of different magazines and that for the military, and this one is for the M16 rifle. And I happened to have the pencils to this cover here, right here, and it was probably inked. What they would do is a lot of times they'd probably either light box it or maybe do probably put like a vellum or something over it, like a tracing paper almost, and ink it from that. Probably Mike Plug would have been the inker on something like this, right?
I would think.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but anyways, this is Eisner's pencils for it in that. And he used to draw everything in blue pencil first. I have a couple things for him. And then he'd do the pencil work from it. Very neat. Well, let's see here. Or here's one of these Joe Doe posters, by the way, from the 40s. I got a whole bunch of these and that. He probably did a couple dozen of these different posters. And actually, the Library of Congress has some, but they don't have all the ones that I have, so they're going to get these. It's taken me a number of years to find all these posters, and I buy them whenever I can. But these are actually, World War II posters that would go up in maintenance areas and stuff like that. And it's, Eisner would do them all. Very talented guy. Let's see here. Oh. You guys are here with Frank Frazetta? Okay. Well, Frank Frazetta, if you don't know him, you've seen his work. He became best known as a painter for things like Conan the Barbarian. And if you remember Vans back in the 1970s used to have the barbarians on them, stuff like that. That's all based on Frank Frazetta artwork, okay? The whole barbarian image is based on Frank Frazetta. Well, when he was just starting out, he was basically at this time, this would have been about 1948, so he would have been about 18, 19 years old. Him and Al Williamson did this. I had Williamson sign it for me when I met him. This was a Western story they did in 1948 when they were both kids. And like I say, it's hard to tell how talented both these guys were, but still, when you consider how young they were, again, these are teenagers doing this stuff. It's amazing. And that's why I treasure this page here. His daughter is a Facebook friend of mine and she was really impressed that I had this. She thought it was pretty neat. Yeah, you see a little bit of Frazetta in that right there. You can sort of see it. Let's see here. This is an original artwork, but when in the 1940s, DC had Siegel and Schuster go around and appear around the country to promote Superman during the war. And what they would do is they'd show up at movie theaters and stuff like that. And they'd have a bunch of kids, come by and they'd sign autographs and stuff like that. Well, they also handed out posters. Okay, this is the only one I've ever found because most of these posters were thrown away. Kids would take them and they'd color them. They were given to kids when they go to the theater. Well, I picked this up last year, and again on eBay, and it was stuck. The guy didn't know what it was. He said, "Well, this was drawn by Joe Schuster, and it was something they would get when they'd go to the theater." And I got pictures of them handing out pictures like this in movie theaters, about 1942, 43, somewhere around there, early part of the war. Don't think too much about it, Mike, okay?
You probably had to draw it the day before the appearance.
Right. Let's see.
I called Will one day when he was coming back from WinterCon, and I tried to only call him on the Jewish holidays because otherwise I would call him every day. And he would, and he said, I said, "Well, how did it go?" And he said, "Oh, well, people gather around, they say nice things about me. It was fine. It was fine." And I said, "Was there something wrong, Will?" And he said, "I won my own damn award again."
Just so you know, he's talking about the highest award you can basically get is the Eisner Award, and they give it away at the San Diego Comic-Con. Well, what do they call it now, Comic-Con International or whatever. And Eisner lived so long that he ended up winning his own award.
Several times
for his graphic novels and that.
He did a series of graphic albums
Right.
about basically about the 30s in the
Right.
Jewish neighborhoods where he grew
Right,
up.
things like Dreamer and The City and stuff like that. Again, you can go on and on about Eisner. I consulted on the autobiography. He did an autobiography of the guy I know named Bob Andelman a few years back, and I work with Andelman on the book and that. And matter of fact, a whole chapter of the book is an interview with me. Big whoop. Anyway, it's interesting stuff. Superman also became a comic strip, okay? And this is where Siegel and Schuster made their money. They really didn't make it off the comic book itself, but they were lucky that they had a separate contract with the McClure Syndicate to create a comic strip. And they ended up making probably $1 million over about a 10-year period, which in the 1940s was pretty good, okay? So they didn't starve. Even though they sold the character for $130, they didn't starve. Anyways, this is 2 panels from 1942 of a Superman comic strip. And the reason why there's only 2 panels is because they would tear them up and throw them away when they were done. And there was a kid who was working in their shop, in the Joe Schuster comic shop who couldn't bear to see him throwing the artwork away. And his name was Joe Giella. Okay, Joe Giella later became a comic book artist himself in that. He's particularly known as an inker, especially like on Batman of the 1960s. And he's still alive today. He's in his 90s and that. But I bought this from his son, Frank, some years back. And this is created by the Schuster shop. Schuster himself probably didn't draw the entire thing. He probably just did the faces on the characters and that. But it's kind of neat. You know, it's got Superman in it, and it's got Lois Lane in it, and stuff like that. And it's not something that you usually see. This is one of the, as far as I know, one of the oldest existing pieces of written artwork. Well, it's not the oldest. I know. Come on, George. I know that. He's over shaking his head. But it's one of the older pieces of Superman artwork that's still floating around. See, George is here to keep me honest. Let's see. Oh, somebody asked me what the biggest comic book ever was. This is it. You can buy this back in 1968 for 98 cents. Okay, it's one of my favorite comics of all time. It has stuff in there by Wally Wood and Doug Wildey and all these other artists and everything. It was mostly West Coast artists who worked on this at the time. A lot of these same artists did a thing called drag cartoons and cartoons, stuff like that. Matter of fact, I just happen to have this right here. There was an artist named Alex Toth, okay, who, if I could draw like anybody in the world, it'd be Alex Toth. Because Alex Toth understood comics in a way that I don't think anybody else did as far as like design is considered. It was just brilliant what the man could do. He could draw anything. Anyways, he became a big-time animator. And throughout the 1960s, he worked for Hanna-Barbera. And basically, any Hanna-Barbera cartoon you ever saw was designed by Alex Toth. He created Space Ghost and all these other characters. Yeah. Well, he also continued working in comics at the same time, in comic books. And this is from drag cartoons that he did, which was a comic book series. Oh, sorry. It was a comic book series, comic books which were based upon, you know, drag racing cars. And even though it sounds kind of silly, cars were big back in the 60s, okay? Anyways, this is one of the, it's a 2-page story he did. And I even used one of these faces as my avatar on comics, in case you guys are wondering. That's what people always say, like, where did that come from? And this is where it's from. I just love Alex Toth's artwork and stuff like that. Again, it's genius. To me, there was a Mount Rushmore of comic books. It's 4 guys. It's Will Eisner, Jack Kirby, Alex Toth, and Harvey Kurtzman, who created this, Mad. Mad was done for EC again. And Harvey Kurtzman was brilliant. He was a brilliant satirist. He was a brilliant writer, a great editor, and a terrible businessman. You know, he also tried publishing some stuff on his own, and he failed terribly at it. He ended up working for Hugh Hefner, and he did a thing called Little Annie Fanny. It was published in Playboy for years, and it was the biggest success he probably had personally and stuff like that, even though he was embarrassed you know, to do it. But he was being paid huge amounts of money to do it, so he continued to do it. But he created Mad for EC, and then he had a falling out with EC, with Bill Gaines, because he didn't think he was really getting enough money and credit for doing it. So he quit, and they hired, well, they didn't hire, but they gave it to Al Feldstein, who was already working at EC, to take it over, and he turned it into Mad Magazine, which is what everybody remembers nowadays, is the magazine version of it. But EC basically got into publishing magazines because they got out of the comic book business. They were driven out by the Comics Code Authority and everything. Because the comics they published were so, you know, extreme for the people at the time, that they basically stopped publishing all comics and went right into magazines and started publishing Mad Magazine. They had the last laugh because it became a huge success. Let's see if there's anything else that might be interesting. Oh, I'll show you this one. One of the characters that Marvel came up with in the 1970s was Conan the Barbarian. They started doing a comic book version of Conan the Barbarian. And Roy Thomas, who was writing it, the guy who years before had been working with Jerry Bales as a comic fan, he took a minor character from the Conan novels. Conan originally appeared in pulp magazines. It was by Robert Howard. And they did a comic book version. Well, the minor character that he took and made a bigger character was called Red Sonja. Ended up later making a movie of it in the 1980s with Brigitte Nielsen as the character. Anyway, it was drawn by a guy named Frank Thorne. And this particular page, usually comic pages are not colored, okay? But this page here, there was an artist named Bill Ray, okay? In the 1970s, when this page was published, if you had, artwork in it, you'd take it to Bill Ray at a convention, and he would hand color it for you in watercolor, in inks and stuff like that. And it's gorgeous. I mean, it's like a painting, what he did here with it. And, he's seen it before. I've shown it to him, and he thought it's pretty cool. Anyways, that's what that is. See it? Okay. That's probably enough, right? You guys tired of this? Okay. I'll end it right now, unless you got any particular questions or anything. Does anybody have? What?
What's the future of comics?
No, they're not going to exist. Comic books as a printed thing are not going to exist. Almost all print material is going to disappear, unfortunately. It already is. Comic books, like I say, at one time in the 1960s, a comic book that sold 100,000 copies a month would be canceled. Now, there's only a couple comics that sell 100,000 copies a month. Most sell around 20,000, 30,000 a month, and those are successful comics. It's disappearing, unfortunately. It's ironic what's happened with comic books because it's become more of a licensing opportunity than anything else. And even though there's very talented artists, like, by the way, this is William Messner Loebs over here, a very talented artist and writer. He created a comic called Wolverine, very talented. Wonderful. One of our own. But anyways, comic books, unfortunately, are probably going to die out with these generations in that. They may exist online, to a certain degree, and I'm sure there'll always be a version of the comic book, but as a print item, it's going to disappear. I mean, I can't see any way it can survive. And it's become too, I call them boutique comics. I had a disagreement one time with Scott McCloud about that. I call them boutique comics because comics become so specialized nowadays that it no longer is trying to appeal to a large commercial audience. They have very specific audiences for each comic. And when you do that, you lose the whole point. You lost it as a mass communication thing. And that's unfortunately what's happened to it. It's dying. Again, but that's why I want to record as much of this as I can, before it's all gone. Because like I say, these will disappear. These will disintegrate. I mean, this paper here usually has a lifespan of 25 years. If you don't ever do anything to a newspaper page or pulp page like this, it'll turn to powder within 25 years. It's just pure luck that these existed this long. This is over 80 years old, If you had a piece of paper, it would have turned to dust years ago. So it's all going to be gone. Anything else? Yeah, George.
If you want to read that stuff, all the public domain material, Jumbo Comics, you can't get DC, you can't get Marvel.
Right.
All the wonderful odd stuff from 1938 to about 1960 is available online for free.
Well,
The Comics
yeah,
Plus.
yeah, I know, yes and no. I mean, but there's some that isn't. I mean,
There's
well, I mean, there's some that's still, like, for instance, that's still like, okay, anything by Street and Smith is still under,
no, actually, I've gotten the Street stuff.
no, see,
Maybe not legally.
yeah, I was going to say, yeah, you don't have it legally because it's still under copyright. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, don't ever put that online, George. And see, that's kind of the problem. I mean, it's nice that you can see it online.
Also stuff that's so incredibly scarce that no one.
Exactly. Well, like, for instance, like these wows.
Yeah, I've seen artwork from WoW, I've never seen
Right.
that.
I mean, I'm supposed to scan that for Comic Book Plus, as a matter of fact. I just haven't gotten around to it. But a lot of the stuff still hasn't been, put up there. There's literally millions of comics that have been published over the years, and there's so much stuff that to come from. Like, for instance, this one here, this communist comic here. This is mostly drawn by a guy named Elton Fax. Elton Fax was one of the black artists that I've written about. He was a well-established fine artist, who ended up working in comic books. And he was also a communist. He ended up leaving the United States briefly in the early 1950s because of the whole McCarthy thing and everything, and he moved to Mexico for a couple of years. But Elton Fax basically drew most of this comic here. It's very interesting. I say I hope you guys buy that book when it comes out next year now, because there's a lot of information about him and all these other guys. It's the first Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer comic. Is this cool or what? When I was a kid, we used to get this. It used to come out once a year, just before Christmas. And I loved these comics, these Rudolph comics. This is the first issue here and that. Anyway. This was another black artist. Oh, I'm sorry, just 1 second. I'll give you a second, John. This was drawn by Matt Baker. Matt Baker was probably one of the 10 greatest comic book artists of all time. Love, love, love Matt Baker's artwork. He's mostly known for like cheesecake type artwork like this, but he was just a brilliant illustrator. And he was basically self-taught, and he ended up dying really young. He died in his 30s, and he died of a heart attack. But he was a black artist, and he worked for Archer St. John, that guy I mentioned earlier, this very forward-thinking publisher, as his art director, which is the only black guy to hold that position ever in comic books at the time. But Archer St. John ended up dying of a drug overdose in 1955, and Matt Baker ended up out on the street, and he died just a couple of years after. One more comic, real quick. This is called Slapstick Comics, okay? This is done by a guy named Paddock, Munson Paddock. This is right at the end of his career. Munson Paddock was a longtime illustrator, correct? Yeah. And a comic book artist and that. And for some reason, in the last year or so of his career, he started doing this really bizarre kind of comic art, okay? And this is the ultimate one here. It's called Slapstick Comics. And if you were to look at this, look it up online, if nothing else. You can see it on Comic Book Plus. Some of the strangest comic book artwork you'll ever see in your life, and this is like 1946 that he did this. Really cool, really strange. Oh yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, this is sort of stuff that Craig loves. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, I guess that's about it. I've held up you guys long enough for that.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for putting up with me.